Supernatural, Meeting with the Ancient Teachers of Mankind, presented by Graham Hancock. In this lecture, Graham delivered an inspiring story about ayahuasca, the sacred plant of the Amazon, and ideas about how it stimulated evolution. Recorded live at Megalithomania Conference 2006.
Nice to see you all here. Supernatural is a bit of a departure for me in relation to my previous work. And it may seem a bit off theme for this conference because it's dealing more with the upper Paleolithic than with the Neolithic. But actually I do touch on the Neolithic as well in this talk. So let's just get straight into it. Of course, if the projector will work. There we are. Amazon rainforest. 80,000 different species of plants and trees. Our species is in the process of removing this wonderful resource at the moment. Wrong way. Amongst those plants and trees, this bush is of great interest. Its botanical name is Psychotria viridis, and it's known in the Amazon as chacruna. And I'm with the shaman Francisco Montes Shuna here. He is an ayahuasca shaman, which I'll explain in a moment. Oh, dear. Now, here's a second of those Amazon plants. It's a vine. It's called the ayahuasca vine. It means the vine of souls. And if you take these leaves from, I'll get used to it in a minute, from the chacruna plant, if you were to take these leaves and cook them up into a tea and drink the tea, absolutely nothing would happen to you at all. And that's odd on the face of things because the leaves actually contain an extremely powerful hallucinogen, which is totally illegal in this country, and that hallucinogen is called dimethyltryptamine, DMT. But DMT cannot, in the normal course of events, be absorbed orally. And if people want to take DMT in this country, they either have to smoke it or inject it. There's an enzyme in the stomach that destroys it on contact. However, in the ayahuasca vine, in the vine is another chemical, and that switches off the enzyme in our stomach. So if you mix these two items together, about 300 of the Psychotria viridis leaves and about 20 lengths of the vine, put them into a cooking pot, pour in a lot of water from the river, and cook it for hours and hours and hours until the water reduces to a thick mass at the bottom. Then you pour that off, you add more water, and you do this again all night long until finally you're left with about a liter of this dark and extremely obnoxious liquid. Now, I've drunk ayahuasca just 11 times so far. I'm going back to Brazil to drink it some more in July. I have to say that it is very likely the most awful taste on the planet. If you think of essence of old socks mixed with toads, sulfur, and other unpleasant things, that's the taste of ayahuasca. The moment it passes your lips, you absolutely know that you're in for a very serious experience. You have no doubt about that whatsoever. It's a kind of shudder as it goes down. And particularly when it's taken in this very concentrated form, you drink an equivalent of about a double shot of spirits in a small glass. After about 45 minutes, two things are happening. The first thing that's happening is you are feeling sick. You're feeling nauseous, dangerously dizzy. rumblings are beginning to take place in your stomach. And pretty soon you're going to have to dash off into the jungle and you're going to have to relieve yourself because it gives you very severe diarrhea and very severe vomiting. Now, we Westerners are not very good at diarrhea and vomiting in public settings. This is something about the ayahuasca experience that is quite difficult to get used to, but I think it's a very important part of it because what these purging aspects of ayahuasca are really telling you to do is to let the body alone, forget about the body, concentrate on what's happening in the mind. That's where it matters. Now, some people in this room have drunk ayahuasca, but I would hazard a guess that the majority of you have not. And it's sometimes difficult to explain the world that you go into, and it is another world, when ayahuasca starts to work on the brain. But fortunately, a number of shamans are gifted artists, and we can get some idea of the ayahuasca world from the paintings of Pablo Amaringo here. It's a world filled with intelligence in everything. These jaguars that almost everybody who drinks ayahuasca, wherever they come from, sees jaguars like this, and also huge serpents, emanated an extraordinary kind of intelligence and seem to communicate with you in a telepathic way. I'd like you just to note a few other features of this other painting, again by Pablo Amaringo. And bear in mind, what Pablo's doing here is he's drinking ayahuasca. He's having the 3-hour ayahuasca trip. He's having the experiences with ayahuasca. The next morning, with those experiences clear in his memory, he sits down and paints and recalls what he saw. So just a few details to look at here. The serpents, animals with human heads, and this extraordinary rich combination of patterns and colors. Now, this is a painting by Alex Gray. He's a Western artist, American artist, but also following an ayahuasca session. And the question that I want to ask here is, what is going on with ayahuasca in our minds? Is it just brain candy? That's what most of our scientists would say. There's a war on consciousness in our society, which goes by the misleading name of the war on drugs. There's a certain kind of consciousness that Western society values, and that is alert, problem-solving consciousness, which actually is about 2% of our consciousness. The other 98% of our consciousness, Western society ridicules, abuses, criminalizes, demonizes. And most Western scientists would say, yes, these experiences are just brain candy. It's just absolutely meaning and not important at all. But scientists who've actually drunk ayahuasca, rather than commenting about it on the basis of prejudice, as well as shamans who use it consistently in the Amazon, believe that it's about something else. It's about personal transformation. It's about seeing yourself as you really are and seeing reality in a much broader frame than just the bit of reality that can be focused on with alert, problem-solving consciousness. I personally am of this view. I believe that ayahuasca is a transformatory agent. Many people, I think, have a gut reaction against any notion of any chemical transforming us. It seems too easy, doesn't it? We've all grown up in the Protestant ethic, and it seems a Puritan ethic, and it seems somehow wrong that we could be transformed simply by drinking a chemical. But, but if you think about it, the brain is an electrochemical jelly, and every experience that we have is mediated by electricity and chemicals in the brain. So altering the chemical balance of the brain may be producing experiences that are important and valid. I think they are, and let's go ahead a bit further and find out why. From an anthropology textbook, is Homo sapiens just a rather unusual African ape? Answer to that question, yes, definitely. We are just a rather unusual African ape. The genetic difference between us and chimpanzees and gorillas is absolutely tiny. We're extremely close to them. And yet our behavior is obviously very different. We are running the planet, the apes are not. What happened to us that makes those tiny genetic differences so significant in the grand scheme of things? here's the story of the human career. It's 6 million years of boredom. Starts down here with the last common ancestor, the chimpanzee, about 6 million years ago. We go up through the Australopithecines. What's happening is that our ancestors are becoming more upright. We all know the story very well. Their brains are getting bigger, their brow ridges are receding, and this happens over a period of 6 million years until 200,000 years ago, anatomically modern human beings looking exactly like you and me, with exactly the same brain size that we have, in every respect identical to us, appear. Now, what's the story of human creativity during this period? Very dismal, very dismal. Actually, this is the story of human creativity during this whole period. About 2.5 million years ago, this stuff is introduced. It sticks for more than 1 million years. Nobody thinks to change it. No innovation, no creativity. Then the big move, this stuff is introduced. Sticks for another 1 million years. Nobody changes it. 200,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans appear. They have our brains. Do they change it? No, they don't change it. They stick with it. They don't innovate. They don't create. They have no symbolism. They apparently have quite possibly no language. They are just tool-using apes. And the question is, what is it that makes us human? Is it using tools? I don't think so. Crows use tools. Chimpanzees use tools. Gorillas use tools. Is it walking on 2 legs? No. Lots of other creatures walk on 2 legs. I think it's the ability to manipulate symbols, to conceive of something that is not present in front of us. I think this is what makes us different from the other creatures. But you don't see any sign of that when the hardware is introduced. It's not until 40,000 years ago that suddenly, all over the world, an enormous change takes place. And this change is best symbolized and typified by the amazing cave art of Upper Paleolithic Europe. And the earliest cave art dates to 35,000 years ago, and the latest to about 12 or 11,000 years ago. This is Peshmerl Cave in France. You can see how they've used the environment of the cave as a setting in which to present us with this panel. This dates from 26,000 years ago, by the way. If we look closer, we can see that a natural horse-headed spur of rock has been instrumental in the decision to paint horses on this rock. But would conclude that this spur forms the horse's head. Actually, it has its own painted head here. And this one also. And these are tiny, completely out of proportion with the rest of the body. Look also at the dots on the horses. Are they just dappled horses? Well, not quite, because dots extend beyond the bodies of the horses. And what about these curious handprints, this one with 6 fingers? So what at first seems like a rather realistic scene, on closer examination proves not to be so realistic. There's something in the artist's vision that we don't fully understand here. Andy showed this picture from Chauvet. You can see here a figure of a man with the hind legs, the legs of a human being, the buttocks of a human being, but the hump of a bison, the head of a bison, and underneath a prominent pubic triangle of a large woman. You can see her more clearly here. Bison man here, straddling a woman, but she has no head. Instead, her arm is transforming into the head of a lion. Now, for those who say that all the paintings of man-animal combinations in cave art are just images of shamans dressing up in animal skins, I would present this as a definitive answer that that is not the case, because a shaman dressing up in an animal skin cannot transform his arm into a head. This is a process of transformation. Lion, woman, and bison man. The human is conceived of as actually transforming into an animal. Hollenstein-Stadel Cave in Germany. By the way, Chauvet is 33,000 years old, and this is from the same period, about 33,000 years old. Another lion man. And again, the feet are in the form of lion's paws as well. This is a transformed being, part human and part animal. Where did our ancestors get these ideas from? You don't see transformed beings in everyday life. You don't see part lion, part human combinations. Here from Apollo 11 cave in Namibia in South Africa, the earliest surviving rock art of the San Bushman, the hind legs are interpreted by archaeologists as human, but the foreparts as feline. So again, we have a lion man here. Same from the Drakensberg in South Africa. By the way, did I say that Apollo 11 cave is 27,000 years old? This piece would be much younger, probably 7,000 or 8,000 years old at the most. But again, it's a lion man. Now, if we go into the Drakensberg Mountains, a piece about 3,000 years old from the San Bushman, it shows two figures, which are eland men. They're antelope men. They have the heads of antelopes and the bodies of human beings. But this one additionally has feathers growing out of his back. And this one, if you see this rather lumpy object around his body, that's actually two serpents that are coiled around the body of the human being there. And lo and behold, both of those serpents also have the heads of antelopes. Again, clearly, this is not modeled on something seen in nature. There's some kind of event going on in the artist's mind, which is leading him to see this extraordinary imagery. I'm just going to run through a number of comparisons, mainly from Upper Paleolithic Europe and from the art of the San Bushman of Southern Africa, to make the following point, that the clues that will help us to interpret this art are in the art itself. Notice these patterns, the dots, the zigzag lines, the grids here. This from France, of course, this from South Africa. These two are from South Africa, these from France. An ibex, one horn is good, the other is a zigzag line. A human being with his legs transforming into a zigzag. An animal with a grid imposed on its body there. Here from the Cederberg in South Africa, zigzag lines imposed over the figure of dancing women, and these curious diamond patterns down here. We need to understand what these patterns are about and why they appear with figures of animals and humans. Again, a zigzag line, a wavy line imposed on a figure of a bison, a bear with dots all over its body. Back to South Africa, internested curved lines forming almost a boat shape, superimposed over the figure of an animal. South Africa, again, that boat shape is more fully elaborated here, and we have half animal, half human creatures in it. Back to the Cederberg. Again, that boat shape, internested curved lines, an outer zigzag, a kind of lozenge shape here, and very similar patterns from Altamira Cave in Spain. These cultures, of course, were not in contact with one another. There's an elephant with a superimposed grid from South Africa. Needless to say, you don't see elephants with grids on their bodies in everyday life. Lascaux, two ibexes separated by a grid. What is that grid doing there? El Castillo Cave, more grids and flows of dots moving down through them in this very open manner. It was an early precursor of the Windows logo there. Cederberg, a window shape with flows of dots going through it. Drakensberg and Altamira Cave, ladder patterns. And in fact, if we come to the Neolithic period and we go to Knowth, passage grave in Ireland, you'll find this panel, which again contains many of the same zigzag, diamond-shaped patterns, starbursts, internested curved lines. So clearly, whatever was inspiring the Upper Paleolithic artists to paint these patterns was inspiring the Neolithic artists too. And of course, these patterns are very common in Neolithic art. Now, it was neuropsychological research that gave the first clue as to what all these commonalities are about between cultures that had nothing whatsoever in common with one another. In most cases, this neuropsychological research into altered states of consciousness is done by getting human volunteers, exempting them from the law, and giving them powerful hallucinogens, typically LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, or DMT, indeed. And they then report what they've seen, what kind of experiences they've had, what sort of visions they saw. Can get exactly the same reports of exactly the same visions from other techniques of putting people into altered states of consciousness. It's the altered state of consciousness that matters. The method of getting into it can vary. There's a huge range of techniques. Rhythmic dancing is extremely good, and that's what the San in South Africa use. They do not use drugs. They dance for about 24 hours until they enter a trance state, and then they see the visions. Now, these visions have been codified by neuropsychologists into stages. In the first stage, they're called these patterns are what are seen in the first stage, zigzag lines, starbursts, etc. In the second stage, we start to construe them into shapes. Then typically volunteers report passing through some kind of vortex. And at the end of the vortex, they emerge into a completely altered reality where beings that we never see in daily life are encountered. And the modern volunteers very frequently see human-animal hybrids as well. If we go to the first stage of this process and we see all these, where these patterns are seen, they're called entoptic phenomena. And enough research on this has been done worldwide to codify a kind of chart of the main entoptic phenomena. The first scholar to realize that there was a connection with art was Geraldo Reichel Dolmatov, who wrote a book called The Shaman and the Jaguar, worked with the Tucano Indians in the Amazon. And he found that after their ayahuasca sessions, because they drink ayahuasca twice a week, that they would sit down and paint patterns the next day on bark, sometimes on the ground, sometimes on the sides of huts. And those patterns are, of course, the same as the entoptic phenomena registered by Western volunteers in altered states of consciousness. David Lewis Williams of the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa took this whole analysis much further, and he's demonstrated, and I think it's quite clear, that the main characteristics of the patterns in Upper Paleolithic art are virtually identical to those recorded by Western volunteers today in visionary states. And we find the same patterns occurring in the rock art of the San in South Africa and in the rock art of the Coso in the California Great Basin. Now, the last of the southern San were not wiped out until the 1920s, and anthropologists were able to work with them. And they were able to speak for themselves. They told us that their shamans danced all night until they bled from the nose, that their spirits then left their bodies and they went into another world, and that's where they saw these patterns and shapes. Same with the Coso. We can't go back and talk to a shaman from the Upper Paleolithic, but it's a good deduction, since the patterns and shapes are the same, that we are dealing with artists who have been experimenting with altered states of consciousness. And that in these altered states, they found the inspiration for the art that they created. Now, as I mentioned, there are stages. Let's look at it across the three different cultures, the San, the Coso, and the Paleolithic art. Curved lines into a boat shape, construed differently here. We can see in stage 2 more complex imageries appearing, and in stage 3, we finally begin to meet beings who don't look quite like everyday beings we meet on Earth. And those beings are also reported by modern lab volunteers, and very frequently take the form of man-animal hybrids. Now, shamans all over the world, emerging from altered states of consciousness, induced by whatever means, also routinely report and frequently paint visions of man-animal hybrids. We're looking at an imagery from South Africa here, about 3,000 years old, humans transforming into fish. Here from one of Pablo Amaringo's ayahuasca paintings, again, the same idea, humans transforming into fish. And it would seem reasonable to suggest that it is the common inspiration from altered states of consciousness that provides this common imagery. Here, again, from South Africa, we see perched on a zigzag, an entoptic pattern, we see these curious creatures, which are human beings transforming into antelopes. Let's not pretend that these are human beings dressed up in animal skins. They are in the process of turning into antelopes. And I think it's obvious when we find precisely the same kind of creatures, part animal, part human hybrids, painted in the Upper Paleolithic, that shamans were involved, and that they depicted very similar hybrid beings because they were in very similar altered states of consciousness. And I'm happy to say that this is, in fact, the majority view in the world of anthropology now. It's very rare that I find myself agreeing with academics, but the academic analysis of cave art, mainly the work of David Lewis Williams, has been an extraordinary breakthrough and helped us to reach out and touch the minds of those early artists. And it is possible for us to share the experiences of those early artists, but most of the academics stop short at that point and don't want to experiment with altered states of consciousness themselves. Here's a painting from a Jivaro shaman in eastern Ecuador under the influence of ayahuasca, and very similar to this bizarre creature from the cave of Lascaux in France. Let's look again at this wonderful painting of Pablo's, and let's look at some details from it. Here, from the Drakensberg, a human figure with a serpent coiled around it. And here, from Pablo's paintings, a human limb with a serpent coiled around it. Obvious similarities here with the patterns of dots. Again, let's go into this picture a little bit. Let's take a look at those jaguars, the way these dots outline the outside of the body. Find exactly the same thing in a South African hybrid animal, eland feline, with the dots, again, outside the body. Tucano Indian shaman, after drinking ayahuasca, paint these patterns, remembering what they saw in an altered state of consciousness. We find virtually identical patterns on the megalithic art, the Neolithic art all around the world, here from Gavrinis. Is it too great a leap to imagine that those artists in the Neolithic cultures were also experiencing altered states of consciousness? And this is why they're showing the same things. But let's look more closely at some of Pablo's amazing ayahuasca pictures. Here we see the familiar cast of characters, the part human, part animal figure, the amazing colors. But up here we see something most unusual. We see what we would call a UFO, a spaceship, some sort of flying saucer. Now, what's Pablo Amaringo in the middle of the Amazon doing, seeing flying saucers under the influence of ayahuasca? What's going on here? There's another of Pablo's pictures. Again, there's a flying saucer in it. Note this tree, by the way, coming to life here with intelligent heads in the tree. But the flying saucer. On my own ayahuasca experiences, I kept a notebook afterwards, and I was amazed to have what I would have to interpret as a near abduction experience by aliens under the influence of ayahuasca. Now, physically, I certainly wasn't being abducted. I was sitting on the floor of a jungle hut. I didn't go anywhere, but my mind had some kind of abduction experience. And this is odd because I've never been a big fan of aliens. I've never felt I needed aliens to explain the mysteries of prehistory. I always felt it could be explained fully in human terms. And so these images of particularly this distinctive sort of high domed forehead and narrow pointed chin and sometimes large dark eyes, this imagery just thrust itself upon me without any prior thinking about it during the ayahuasca session. If we go back to the painted caves, there are, in fact, objects on the walls that do look a bit like flying saucers. This one from Altamira, and this curious object from Bernifal. If we were to see something like that flying around in the sky today, we would call it a flying saucer. And in the arts, there are also beings that we might call aliens today, beings with high foreheads and narrow pointed chins. Here's a flying object and a being associated with it. This one's from South Africa, this from Peshmerga Cave in France. And if we look a bit more closely at this fellow here, we can see that he has the high domed forehead, the narrow pointed chin, and the large dark eyes of the kind of being that people would typically call aliens today. And of course, nobody would believe them, but that's what they would call them. I think the similarities are fairly obvious. Now, I do think there's a connection, but as I state here, I don't think that such experiences have got anything to do with physical aliens coming here on nuts and bolts spaceships from other parts of this physical universe. I think they're the latest manifestation of an extremely ancient, non-physical, spiritual phenomenon. But I also think that phenomenon is real. I do not think it is an illusion, and I will come to this as we go along. These images are called meanders by the archaeologists. You find them all over the cave ceilings, typically dating back to 30,000 years down to about 12,000 years ago. Except one of them, one of these four images, actually wasn't painted by an Upper Paleolithic artist. It was drawn in 1990 by an American woman who believes that she was regularly abducted by aliens. And she said before the aliens abducted her, they projected this image into her mind. And it's this one. This is from 1990. All the others are from 15,000 BC. San Bushmen images. The San were destroyed by the whites in South Africa, but their cousins, the Kalahari Bushmen, still preserve many of the San traditions and perform the trance dance, and their shamans still speak about their experiences. And their shamans speak about climbing threads of light to objects in the sky. Many UFO abductees have the same experience. Sometimes they're just drawn up into the sky. Sometimes they actually see a thread or a rope of light that carries them up into the sky. And I think what's going on here is construal. The same experience is being construed in different ways by different cultures. When we see beings like this, well, we're from the generation that invented space travel. We've sent men to the moon. It's natural to us to think that creatures like this must come from other planets and have an interest in us, the same kind of interest that we might have in another planet. So we call them aliens today, and we think that explains them. But you don't have to go very far back to find identical kinds of beings being called something else, being called fairies and elves. And in fact, fairies and elves do very many of the same kind of things to human beings that aliens supposedly do, typically abducting them and leading them to be ridiculed. People who believe in fairies are, of course, supposed to be lunatics, and so are people who believe in aliens. But maybe what they're having is a real experience which they're trying to interpret and explain in terms of their own culture. It's not widely known, except by people who study the UFO literature very carefully, but often the alien abductors first present themselves in the form of animals, or part animal, part human hybrids. These ones arrived in this little spaceship, and this is what they looked like to the Malaysian school children who drew them in 1973. Often, the alien will first appear as an owl, sometimes as a part animal, part human hybrid, sometimes in a fully animal form, and then will transform into the more recognizable gray or whatever, narrow-pointed chin and high-domed forehead. I'm reminded of the spirit animals, of shamans, which also frequently abduct shamans and take them away. That's the experience that they have. Very frequently, owls are involved. And we find owls with humanoid characteristics painted in the painted caves. This is an engraving from Peshmerga Cave in France, about 17,000 years old. And sometimes we see these beings transforming into animals. back in the cave paintings, or fully transformed into animals or part animal, part human figures. And in this case, in an object that is clearly in the sky in relation to this figure here. Fairies, often associated with the human form, but very frequently we find described as part animal, part human, and sometimes fully transformed into animals. I think there's something in common with all of this. Here's a woodcut from the 14th century, fairies dancing in a ring, partially transformed between humans and animals. The medieval fairy Melusine was greatly feared, and she's another one of these part animal, part human hybrids. She's part serpent, part human. She was feared because she used to abduct human babies. Well, of course, it's well known that those who believe they've been abducted by aliens very frequently report encounters involving babies, the abduction of human babies, almost a kind of breeding program that the aliens are somehow to be breeding with human beings and producing hybrid babies. And some of the abductees experience being taken up into the sky and actually to cuddle or hold a hybrid baby in that state of mind. Again, many shamans believe that they have a wife or a husband in the spirit world. In fact, this belief is so strong amongst shamans that it often causes them problems with their wife or husband in this world. They're being unfaithful to him or her with a spirit in the other world, and they believe they have babies in the other world. So another curious comparison there. Now, the research that really sheds light on what's going on here was done by Dr. Rick Strassman at the University of New Mexico. He was the first researcher in the United States to get permission from the federal government to conduct a detailed program with human volunteers and hallucinogens for more than 20 years. And Rick gave his volunteers DMT in injectable form. 80% of them reported the kind of experience that others would describe as an alien abduction experience. And we know they weren't abducted because they were right there on the hospital bed in front of Rick Strassman. Their consciousness, however, felt like it had been abducted, and they met beings exactly like those that we call aliens. Now, Rick's suggestion is that the DMT is making these experiences possible. It is not creating these experiences. Rick points out that the pineal gland in the human brain produces DMT. Though DMT is illegal, every single person in this room is carrying in the center of their brains an illegal drug right now. And that illegal drug is DMT. And Rick's suggestion is that those who have alien abduction experiences, and in the past they would have called them fairies, and shamans still call them spirits, are either those who spontaneously overproduce DMT, and that seems to be about 2% of every human population, or they are those who are able to retune the receiver wavelength of their brain by adding some suitable chemical. Most of the time, we are tuned into channel normal, but Rick points out that some of the other stations that we can tune into may be just as important as channel normal, perhaps even more important. And as I say, the facilities are there. Plants have evolved alongside us over thousands and hundreds of thousands of millions of years, which, if we consume them, will allow us to slip into that altered state of consciousness. And in Rick's view, to change the receiver wavelength of the brain. And in fact, it's certain that electromagnetic fields also do this, and there may be subtle energies associated with particular sites and places on the planet which have a direct effect on consciousness and allow these kind of experiences in. I said at the beginning, science is very dismissive of hallucinations. And there's an automatic assumption that in the case of the perceptions that we call hallucinations, the brain is simply making them up. You can actually put somebody who's hallucinating into a brain scanner and you will see definite changes taking place in the brain. And the simplistic assumption of most scientists who haven't taken hallucinogens themselves is that these changes are the experience. That there's nothing more to the experience than that. The brain is just a factory. But I think this analogy helps to make clear how false that logic is. Because if you wanted to look at a particularly distant star, you would have to focus your telescope to look at it. And that focusing would involve changes in the relationship of the lenses inside the barrel of the telescope. You'd be quite wrong to say that those changes in the lenses were the star. The star is really there. The changes in the lenses allow you to see it. And this is the suggestion of what is really happening with the shamanic plants that alter our consciousness, that they are retuning the receiver wavelength of the brain and allowing us to pick up other realities that are all around us, but that we normally do not attend to and normally can't see. And that therefore these experiences are not brain candy, but the possibility of opening a secret doorway inside our own minds and projecting our consciousness through into another realm. Of course, this is the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, Switzerland. Quantum physics, one of the reasons it's being built is to explore parallel dimensions, which quantum physicists are convinced exist. Maybe we don't need the largest scientific instrument on the planet and billions of dollars of expenditure. Maybe we've all got the instrument inside our heads already. Maybe all we have to do is retune the receiver wavelength of the brain, and we can explore those other dimensions. And therefore, when people in the past spoke of fairyland being taken off in the dance, taken inside a hollow hill to some other world, maybe we should take those experiences a little more seriously. Maybe those were experiences of exploration of a parallel realm. So that's one possibility, the secret doorway inside our own mind. But again, the mainstream scientific view of these extraordinary experiences that we call hallucinations is that they are of no significance. And the suggestion is that somehow they're just hardwired into the brain. It absolutely beats me why a universal experience of contact with small beings who take us up to objects in the sky and conduct strange experiments with us should be hardwired into all our brains. I just don't understand why evolution would produce an experience like that. But nevertheless, let's take this notion that hallucinations are hardwired into our brains seriously. It's a parallel, a separate notion to the notion that the spirit world is real. Let's take these notions seriously and see where they lead us. Well, there we are with the ayahuasca combination. The shamans in the Amazon believe that ayahuasca is an intelligent being and that it and the spirits it introduces us to pass on to us actually very vital and essential knowledge. The shamanic view is that we live with the spirit world whether we like it or not. It is there. It interacts with us all the time. We can either stick our heads in the sand, which is what Western culture is doing right now, or we can engage with it, which is what shamanic cultures are doing. And they believe it's important to engage with the spirit world and that huge benefits come to us as a result in terms of knowledge. Here's DMT, the active molecule in ayahuasca. Here's LSD. Actually, they're both extremely closely related, built around what's called a tryptamine ring. And here's the shocking truth about Francis Crick. It used to be said that he and Watson were inspired by the beer at the Eagle pub in Cambridge, but Crick admitted that this was not the case, and that he had in fact been a regular user of LSD during the 1950s. LSD was legal at that time, and he felt that it enhanced his thinking powers. And Crick admitted that he perceived the double helix shape while on LSD. And interestingly enough, here from Pablo Amaringo's ayahuasca visions with closely related DMT, we see again the double helix shape. Now, the difference between Pablo Amaringo and Crick is that Crick's mind was prepared. He could take that vision and use it. Pablo Amaringo's mind is not prepared to get into detailed modern chemical analysis, so he wouldn't interpret that as the DNA molecule, but it's understandable why Crick did. Something else about Crick, which is really amazing. This is the man, let's just make this clear. He won the Nobel Prize for establishing the structure of DNA. I mean, if you want to talk about DNA, Crick is your man. Crick would have been horrified at any notion that he could be associated with creationism. Crick was an atheist. He was a hardline scientist. He was absolutely against any notion of supernatural beings creating life on Earth. And yet, purely from the scientific point of view, Crick could not accept that the DNA molecule evolved on this planet. He absolutely couldn't accept it. It's such a complicated thing, and its relationships with the proteins, which are themselves complicated, are so complicated that it's the idea that a primeval soup with molecules bumping into each other accidentally assembled the amazing magic of DNA is rather similar to suggesting that a hurricane in a junkyard could assemble a fully functional Boeing 767. No way. Crick couldn't accept that. He felt that the DNA molecule just didn't have time to evolve on this planet. The early Earth had life too fast for this to have evolved in any accidental way, and so he felt it must have evolved somewhere else. And his suggestion was that in a distant galaxy, far away, a planet revolving around a star evolved intelligent life, and those intelligent beings, more intelligent than us, more advanced than us in his scenario, discovered that they faced certain destruction. Perhaps there was going to be a supernova explosion in their immediate vicinity, would fry their planet. They would not be able to get themselves, their own bodies, out of there. The distances in interstellar space are just too great. But what they could do was they could have the DNA of their planet survive. They could send bacteria in spaceships out into the universe. It's called directed panspermia. And this was Crick's theory about how life started on Earth. This is not my theory. This is the Nobel Prize winner's theory. That it started on Earth because a distant civilization sent bacteria to this planet. They hit the early Earth, landed in the lifeless primeval soup, took advantage of it, began multiplying as bacteria do. Over billions of years, they gradually evolved into us. Now, DNA, really amazing thing. It has an alphabetic character. It has these four bases: adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine, A, C, G, and T. And you can actually think of them as letters or as a code because the particular organization of groups of three of these letters tells the body to assemble certain amino acids and to build them together into proteins. This is how our bodies are made. It's by the genetic code. And an alteration of the arrangement of those letters produces very different kinds of bodies. The curious thing is that our genes that do all of this assembly process are just 3% of our DNA. The other 97% of DNA has typically tended to be called by scientists junk DNA. And this seems to me an extremely unparsimonious suggestion, that over billions of years of evolution, 97% of DNA should just be junk, carried around in all our bodies and every animal's body, and only 3% actually does anything, not be there. And he would have confronted issues about himself that I honestly believe would lead him one step on the road to becoming a very different person. I said that we feel uncomfortable about personal transformation being so easy as drinking something. Of course, it isn't as easy as that. Altering the chemical balance of the brain will allow these experiences in. But what we do with these experiences is up to us. The experiences themselves will do nothing unless we are prepared to transform ourselves and to work with those experiences. Your mind must be prepared to do something with this material. But when your mind is prepared, then I believe it can bring about a transformation. And I think we saw that transformation. I think we saw it documented in what happened to our ancestors with that extraordinary change that took place after 40,000 years ago. I think what happened was that they stumbled by chance across plant hallucinogens in different cultures at different times. Perhaps in Northern Europe it was mushrooms. I believe it was Psilocybe semilanceata, the liberty cap, that did the trick, actually. Initially tried it out as a food item, had extraordinary experiences, started to see beings that weren't there in front of them in daily life. I think it rocked our ancestors out of 6 million years of nothingness and turned us into what we are today. It may be the case that we are going to miss the boat on the next step in human evolution if we allow our governments to continue to dictate to us what we may and may not experience with our own consciousness. If I am not... Thank you. If I am not sovereign over my own consciousness, then what am I sovereign over? What is the point of talking about democracy endlessly if our democracies tyrannize our consciousness? What is the point of talking about freedom and liberty when we live in societies that rule what I, in the privacy of my own home, doing no harm to another human being, may or may not experience? Yes, I can experience wall-to-wall bubblegum television, but no, I cannot experience a transformatory event in my own consciousness. Yes, I can get drunk and fall on the street and vomit and have fights. No, I can't change my sense of reality. Is that what it is? Are our governments frightened that reality is going to be redefined and that they are suddenly going to become completely pointless? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I'm very happy to take some questions. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes. The gentleman asked me, was I aware that the genome of the cat has, in the middle of it, a repetitive sequence of those chemical letters, CAT, CAT, CAT. It's a nice one. I like it. Yes.
Given that what you've spoken of could be an ancestral memory, what about the shamans? Did they believe that there was, in distant times past, actual entities that you were experiencing through drugs?
The shamans do believe that they are dealing with actual entities. And I think that's what we are dealing with. My own experiences with ayahuasca, with ibogaine, with DMT have very strongly made me feel that that is what is going on here. That for me, it's rather like going to an amazing other country that I've never been to before. And it's, of course, full of intelligent beings, but they speak a different language from me. And so I need to get to know them better. My sense is very much that this is real, that we have constricted ourselves in our definition of reality to the physical and material universe. And our present religion, which is the religion of science, of course, is totally based on the material world being the only world that exists. This is so short-sighted and so stupid. The possibility of multiple other dimensions has been considered seriously.
Did they feel that there was a cut-off point where we stopped experiencing them naturally and then only rekindled that when we found them chemically?
No, I don't think that's the case at all. And I really don't like this idea that if we ingest a plant, that is somehow unnatural, whereas if we have it spontaneously, that is natural. In either case, what is happening is that the chemistry of the brain is being slightly altered. We may do that by releasing an endogenous hallucinogen, like DMT from the pineal gland, or we may have to consume that hallucinogen. But both are natural, just as eating potatoes is natural. We're constantly ingesting and putting out chemicals. So I don't see it as unnatural. And the historical record, the archaeological record, shows that there's really nothing. You can't find anything in the archaeological record that says human beings, human behavior before 40,000 years ago. Yes, you can find tools. Yes, they were hunting a bit, but they weren't what we would call human. They were tool-using apes, and it just suddenly changes. And I think that sudden change is to do with one human group and then another accidentally encountering hallucinogens and perhaps spreading the word, and it goes around the world like that. Yes. As natural as ABC.
No, it's just a thought.
Yeah, why not?
Because a lot of the time people get put off by the titles.
Well, yes, yeah, no, why,
It was
and
just-
that's an interesting point. You're right. People do get put off. Now, why do people get put off by the notion of the supernatural? Because a lot of men in suits have said the supernatural doesn't exist. Yeah. That everything that everything may be explained in terms of physical and material causes. And priests, yes, indeed. Well, what the priests do is they say, we are the sole intermediaries between you and the supernatural. And if you try to relate to the supernatural directly, then we're going to do something nasty to you. In the old days, it used to be burning. Now, a bit different. But yes, this is what the established religions have done. You go to the origins of any of the world's religions, you're going to find a shamanic experience. St. Paul on the Damascus Road. The Prophet Muhammad in his cave meets a supernatural being who gives him the Quran. Joseph Smith meets the angel Moroni. All religions have these supernatural encounters at the beginning. Then within a few generations, the money men and the bureaucrats step in and it becomes a totally human institution. And pretty quickly they outlaw altered states of consciousness, demonize them, and burn those who have them. Yeah.
Graham, you suggested that George Bush might have become a better person if he had drunk this shamanistic substance.
Yeah.
And I share the sentiment that you say we should ourselves experience it, and I share the sentiment to a certain extent in theory and practice. But I just would like to point out to the consequences, of course, of opening up this possibility in our societies. Let's connect this with the question, would you have been against a society like Britain, 39, to withstand a murderous tyranny in Germany, where I come from? Would you have been able to, and would you have been in favor of it?
No, I think it's
to a certain
really
extent, of course, Saddam Hussein's Iraq was a murderous, torturous regime as well.
Yes, I think it's really important to fight murderous tyranny wherever we find it. I just don't think that's what George Bush is doing in Iraq right now. I don't think he's there to fight murderous tyranny. If he was, he'd have been in Rwanda. He'd be in Darfur right now. He's not there. I don't think it's about fighting murderous tyranny. I think it's about extending American power and his particular ego trip that's involved in this. So I don't think your question really applies on that point. But I do, as humans, yes, we should resist tyranny, definitely. Yes.
Egyptian religion with animal-human hybrids, do you think there's a connection with the Blue Lotus?
Yes, I have two chapters in the book, one on the Maya and one on the ancient Egyptians, and a combination of Blue Lotus, mandrake, and opium seems to have been the hallucinogen of choice.
Sounds good to me.
Just pass it over.
You mentioned McKenna in your book, Terence McKenna.
Yes.
I thought there was some sort of weird connection between the Zipf-holograph and time wave zero. I think there's anything in that.
I don't go into time wave zero.
What are your thoughts on
in the book? I don't have any, actually, to tell you the truth. The idea that we're heading to a 0 point in 2012 or something like that.
But
maybe
you spoke about a great change 40,000 years ago.
Yes.
Could it be that maybe that's the part of the novelty, in the
Yeah, I think that we could have change like that again today if our societies weren't so power driven, weren't so anal, weren't so controlling, were prepared to let people explore their full potential as human beings. I think we would have a huge change in the world. I think that change is being held back by legislation at the moment. More than half the people in prison in the United States today are there for so-called drug offenses. I have to say, although it may seem irresponsible to some, I have to say that I am in favor of the total legalization of all drugs. I think that human beings have to be trusted as adults. I don't think our government's job is to look after us as citizens. I think it's to do what we tell it to do. No. Yes. Yes. With the gentleman right there. Yeah.
My question relates to the end of your book when you're about to go into another experience on Salisbury Plain.
Yes.
I'm intrigued to know what happened.
I didn't take enough mushrooms. I didn't. I do find psilocybin quite scary. I don't know why. Set and setting are a very important part of it, but I had a wonderful set and setting that day. There's something about psilocybin that I just find slightly sinister. There's no reason to suppose that the other world is all good, any more than this world is all good. If we deal with the spirit world, we're dealing with powerful forces, and those powerful forces can be negative as well as positive, and they can play on the negative parts in our own character. So it takes strength to resist it. Of the substances I tried, I know many people have had wonderful experiences with psilocybin. I never did, and that day at Avebury, I really should have taken like another 50, and actually I took another 5. So I kind of chickened out. Yes?
You didn't actually mention Jeremy Narby's book on the Cosmic Serpent.
I didn't today. It's mentioned at great length in my book.
But
I know Jeremy personally. We've stayed with him in Switzerland, and I extensively refer to Jeremy's work in the book.
I was just interested when you were just commenting now on the sort of the negative and the positive forces, because I always remember his description of his, I think it's one of the first experiences he had, and there was this huge serpent that was telling him things, but he had the presence of a light force and a dark force on either side of him. And I thought that was really interesting as a kind of, in a way, telling us some sort of truth about the universe. Perhaps.
Yes, I think it is telling us the truth.
I think it's good that you brought that up.
Thank you. I mean, personally, I believe in such a thing as good and evil, and I think rivers of goodness and evil flow through this world, and I think they flow through all other worlds as well. And I think in each case, the position of an intelligent, sentient being is to make a choice, a personal choice in that direction. So the fact that there is evil in the spirit world, just as there is evil in this world, is not a reason not to go there. It's a reason to be careful what you do. Yeah.
I'd like to ask whether, during your ayahuasca experiences in South or Central America, whether you were able ever to look up into the sky and see what John Major Jenkins calls the Hunabku, or the black hole at the center of the galaxy. He has a theory that it can be seen whilst on ayahuasca.
Yeah.
I wondered whether you'd experienced that.
I'll have to try that out in Brazil. I didn't on the last visit, no. Yes?
What about people who take hallucinogenic drugs for recreation? Is that not a wrong path to go down?
I think I wouldn't censor people for taking hallucinogens for recreational purposes. There's nothing wrong with having fun. I think that I gave the analogy of the telescope or the retuning of the receiver wavelength of the brain. And I think that with human beings, part of the process of retuning the receiver wavelength of the brain is the chemical you ingest. And part of it is your purpose in doing so. And part of it is the setting and the circumstances in which you do so. So, if you take a powerful hallucinogen purely for recreational purposes, in a recreational setting, and with no other personal inquiry in mind, that's likely what will happen to you, that you'll have a recreational experience. I think that you need to focus your will and to approach the thing in a serious and extremely inquiring manner, in order to have these shamanic experiences. It may happen that the plant will overwhelm you in a recreational experience and put you into shaman world, but it's less likely to happen. So I wouldn't say no to it, but personally, I wouldn't take them for recreational purposes. I think these are very, very powerful things, and I would always take them for some kind of consciousness development purpose, and that would be conscious in my mind in the process of doing so.
How many more questions do you want to take, Graham?
5.
5. Good.
Yes.
Could I ask, is there any idea what these psychoactive substances are doing in the plants?
Yeah.
Are they there just for us? Are they part of the plant's defense system?
No, they don't really seem to be part of the plant's defense system. It's not clear what they're doing there. It's very odd. Yeah. I think they've co-evolved with human beings, and I think they are there for us. That's my own view. I think they're there for us. I think they're part of the garden that's waiting for us to explore, and I think they're there for a reason. Yes. This gentleman in the braces.
Dynamite talk.
Thank you.
Do you can you equate consciousness expansion with moving into the spiritual world?
Yes.
It's the same thing?
I think it's not inevitable that moving into the spirit world will lead to consciousness expansion, but I think it's likely to. I think it helps. And I think it helps because it confronts you with experiences that you don't have in this world, and you have to deal with those experiences in one way or another. It also, something very curious about ayahuasca and ibogaine, which is another story altogether, something very curious about these two substances is that the ibogaine experience lasts for anything 12 to 24 hours. It's very, very long. The ayahuasca experience lasts for about 3 hours. But during the experience, at a certain point in the experience, you will undertake a personal journey into yourself. I found myself bringing to mind events that had taken place when I was 11 years old, and I'd forgotten about them completely. They came back to mind during the ayahuasca experience. And I found myself realizing that on that day in the summer of 1961, I had done something that subconsciously for a long time I'd really regretted and hadn't felt comfortable with. And it brought it up to the forefront of my consciousness, made me deal with it. Made me deal with lots of issues in my life. I'm not saying that I've necessarily become a better person as a result. I think, probably I haven't. But I've understood faults and weaknesses in myself better than I did before, and it's up to me now to do something with it. For example, the tendency to get wildly angry at just a second's notice. That's something that I found myself really regretting and thinking, what a bore, what a bully, and what a fool I was to get so angry with that person in that situation. So there's a journey of personal self-assessment that takes place. It's often very painful. You're confronted with realities about yourself that you preferred not to know. But if you deal with those realities, I think it can improve you as a person. And just a final word, thank you for this question, just a final word on that is the fantastic success that ayahuasca and ibogaine practitioners have had in getting people who are addicted to hard drugs off those drugs. Both ibogaine and ayahuasca, it's a huge untold story, have produced, I would say, almost supernatural results in ending drug addiction with people who want to end their drug addiction. Very often it's because they have a personal experience that they understand why they're addicted, and the next day they find they have no craving and no withdrawal symptoms, and they're off it. Quite amazing. Yeah.
I'd like to ask you a question about the timeline you presented between the Paleolithic and then the Neolithic.
Yeah.
Suddenly in the Neolithic you get these exquisite geometries coming out in stone circles.
Yes.
And in the stone balls that were dredged up in Aberdeen fields from time to time.
Yeah.
They don't appear in these earlier pictures, apparently.
No, because they weren't placing their art in built structures. They were taking advantage of natural structures. And the suggestion would be that Andy talked about the deep caves and connected it to bombardment of cosmic rays. Cosmic rays actually may be a very important issue in changing human consciousness, and I don't reject what Andy said there at all. I think it's a very interesting point. But the other suggestion might be that this art is put in the deepest part of the caves because that most perfectly recreates or recollects the experience in an altered state of consciousness, of passing through the vortex.
But, I mean, you've produced pictures of Gavrinus, which was going on in parallel with the stone circle geometries of the same period.
That's right, yeah.
In the region.
Clearly something was added in the Neolithic, but something was also taken away, because there's much less of the representative iconic art. It's mainly patterns in the Neolithic. It's mainly the entoptic phenomena rather than the fully iconic figures.
Thank you.
That gentleman there. And then the gentleman behind him with the glasses after that.
Hi, Graham.
Hi.
Do you think there's any link between the submerged cities off the west coast of India and people's fears about rocking the status quo in relation to the Vedas and Soma?
Interesting. Well, Soma, and again, there's a chapter on this in the book. The substance called Soma in the Vedas almost certainly was a plant hallucinogen. Exactly which one it was is widely discussed, but it almost certainly was a hallucinogen. And if you read the Vedic text with that in mind, you can immediately see what's going on. I don't think the work in the Gulf of Cambay and the hold-up on that work has got anything to do with that issue. I think what it's got to do with is that the Archaeological Survey of India were very much, their leading lights were very much trained and schooled in the British mode of archaeology. And they have absorbed and internalized the British version of Indian history. Whereas others in India are very committed to a totally different notion of Indian history, which takes it back much further into the past. And that notion is supported by the underwater cities off the Gulf of Cambay. And actually, I've seen a political conflict between these two groups, which has resulted in a deadlock and virtually no further work being done. Yes?
Hi. You said at the start that supernatural is something of a departure for you from your usual territory. Is it something you're planning to continue looking further into, or are you going to make a return to that sort of?
No, I'm going to continue looking further into it. Exactly where that's going to take me, I'm not certain yet. I spent best part of 15 years of my life working on the issue of a lost civilization, and I put myself on the line for that issue, ultimately with Underworld, where Santa and I put in something like 2,000 dives, scuba dives, all around the world looking for underwater ruins, and literally did risk our lives. I've been fried by the academics. I've been insulted and abused all over the planet. And I finally decided I did enough on that subject. I did everything that I could do. I took it to the final limit. I went diving all around the world. I found stuff. If I go on writing about this, all I'm going to do is repeat myself. I'm not going to bring something new. And in addition to the dissatisfaction of repeating myself, I'm going to go on getting slagged off by everybody on the planet. So I thought it's time for a change. Thank you. Thank you.
This has been a Megalithomania audio production. For more information, visit megalithomania.co.uk.